They said, "Just sign here, mother. This page only confirms you as an occupant, not an owner." And the pen they offered me was the same blue one I used to write permission slips and birthday cards. So familiar, my fingers almost remembered the shape. Before my mind did, and for a second, I felt the old reflex to be agreeable, to be quick, to be small. The reflex they had trained in me for years with gentle voices and calendars I never made but always obeyed, until the ink's glint on that line flashed like a fishhook, and I understood that I was not being asked for trust. I was being tested for extinction. I am 78 now, and I live alone again, in a house that still smells like lemon oil and rain-soaked pine when the windows are open. A house whose floors remember the weight of the children I raised, and whose stair banister carries the dents of moving days and Christmases and a reckless bicycle that should never have been indoors. A house that was once my pride and then my penance, and then, after a long, dry season of being spoken around, my quiet triumph. I keep the deed folded in a plastic sleeve inside the bread box because nobody looks for power where they expect crumbs. And sometimes, on afternoons when the light comes sideways through the dining room and the dust turns to a soft weather in the air, I take it out and trace my name with a finger that trembles only when it chooses to. And I say it the way a woman says a prayer she has made herself, syllable by syllable, first and last, and the hyphen that marriage gave me and grief kept. That day at the lawyer's office is the spark that still smells of singe in my memory. But the kindling was stacked long before. The weeks of reminders that I was forgetful because I put the wooden spoon in the drawer where it has lived for 40 years instead of where my daughter-in-law wanted it to live for 3. The thermostat I was asked not to touch because the system is delicate, as if warm air were a privilege doled out according to age and usefulness. The way my son began calling me by my first name when the conversation involved money, not mom or mama. Those round, easy names that carry love like a bowl carries soup. But Martha, flat and managerial, as if he were speaking to the woman who watered the plants in a lobby they walked through, not the woman who once sold her grandmother's pearls to keep the mortgage current when his father was between jobs. It happens like winter, not a coup but a drift, not a blow but a gathering, and one day you find the path to your own. Front door narrowed by the polite snow of other people's plans for you. I do not pretend I was a perfect mother or an easy woman. I was a storm when the bills were due and a silence when disappointment needed somewhere to sit. I baked bread when the house was too tight with anger, and I salted the soup with apologies that came out late. But I built a life under this roof out of flour and stubbornness, and pay stubs that smelled like toner and bus exhaust. And I know the difference between a signature that honors a lifetime and a signature that cancels it. Which is why my hand, the same hand that has tied shoelaces and bandaged knees and written checks to cover textbooks and traffic tickets I never asked about, would not move toward the page the way they needed it to. The lawyer's waiting room was all sleek chairs and abstract art that looked like bruises learning to speak. The receptionist said my name with the smoothness of someone trained to make everyone feel slightly grateful for being allowed to wait. And my son smiled at me with that patient, over-bright smile he saves for customer service and old people. And my daughter-in-law adjusted the cuff of her cream blazer and asked if I had brought all the little documents, as if my marriage certificate and the last will of a kind man buried 21 winters ago or a handful of paper clips rolling around my purse. I sat there with my good shoes biting a little at the bunion that time gave me, and the brooch I wore to their wedding pinned under my collar where she could not suggest something simpler. And I watched them fidget and whisper and straighten, and I felt, beneath the sting, a strange coolness spreading through me, a kind of long-deferred clarity, because once you hear your child speak to you as if you are a door, he must ease closed without a click. You understand that the weather has changed, and no amount of tea or pleading will bring back the summer. I left that office without signing anything more binding than a smile. I said I had forgotten my glasses, though I could read the serial number on the copier from across the hall, and I carried the packet in my handbag the way a diver carries a wet shell. Not because it is beautiful, but because it is proof of the floor you touched. That night I made stew, the way I have always made it, with cheap cuts and long patience. And I ate at the kitchen table alone, while the house hummed with the gentle arrogance of good appliances, and I listened to the news I did not believe and the rain I always do, and I felt the draft under the back door, and I thought of all the drafts I have learned to live with. Those little leaks of comfort and kindness you tell yourself are nothing because the big walls still stand. And I thought, how quiet a trap can sound when it is padded with the word care. People will tell you that betrayal arrives with shouting, but in my life, it has always arrived with suggestions. Perhaps sell, perhaps move, perhaps let us relieve you of the burden of your own keys. And because love makes a woman polite, I nodded until my neck ached. I smiled until the corners of my mouth felt like they had pins in them. I said, "Thank you for things that were not gifts." And somewhere in the slow wintering of those years, I became a guest in rooms that I paid to heat. And when I finally heard the sentence that tried to end me, "You're just an occupant now," I knew exactly which cupboard the sharpest knife of my resolve was tucked into. Do not imagine that I was brave in a glamorous way, that I slammed doors or raised my voice until the lights trembled. My courage was a pencil and a notepad, dates and names and little quotations written in a careful hand. My courage was an envelope with copies and an old friend who still knew a phone number that was not on a business card. My courage was choosing to sleep in my own bedroom that night instead of the guest room where they had once suggested I would be more comfortable. My courage was opening the window to the wet air and saying aloud, to no one and to the walls that have never left me, no. In the mornings, I polish the banister, because it is work that answers you back with shine. I sweep the porch, because it is good to make a small, clean place in a world that keeps muddying you. I fill the house with soup and radio and the smell of toast. And I notice how the quiet has changed its temperature, how it is no longer the quiet of being ignored, but the quiet of choosing not to be summoned. I am an old woman with a deed and a spine and a memory that keeps better than my children think. And I am telling you this not because I want pity, but because I want a witness. I want one woman who has been called sweet. In the same tone you'd use for a houseplant to hear me when I say that sweetness is not a strategy, and patience is not a will, and that there comes a day when the pen they give you is not a tool, but a shovel, and you must set it down if you do not want to help them bury you I keep the porch light on now, not for visitors, but for myself. A small lighthouse in a neighborhood that thinks money can teach the tide not to come in. And I walk the rooms at dusk, touching the things I earned. This chair with its knit throw, this frame with the boy's toothless grin, this crack in the ceiling like a line on a wise palm. And I think, not with bitterness, but with the steadiness of a woman who has diced 1,000 onions and knows both tears and technique, that the first step of losing a home is not on paper, but in language. The moment you accept being addressed as a problem to be solved, and that the first step of keeping it is to call what is happening by its name before they rename you out of it. They told me it was just a routine matter, nothing to worry about, just some signatures and initials to keep everything tidy. That was the word my son used, as if a life could be folded like laundry and stacked neatly away in a drawer. I was sitting in that office with the blinds drawn halfway, sunlight cut into stripes across the floor, and I remember the sound of the clock, louder than any voice in the room, ticking each second like a warning I did not yet know how to name. The lawyer was polished, too polished, every smile smoothed like glass, and he kept using phrases that sounded harmless but slippery. Transfer for simplification, continuity of legacy, streamlined ownership. My son nodded along as though he understood everything, though I could see in his restless knee and the way he avoided my eyes that he was rehearsing rather than listening, already invested in an outcome he was not supposed to show me. My daughter-in-law touched my arm the way a person taps a car window, more to test than to comfort, and said, "You don't need to read all that, Mother. It's just standard. Everyone does it once they're older." Older, that was the word she leaned on, the hinge of the whole performance, as if my years were a curtain falling over my rights. I picked up the pen, heavy in my hand, and for a breath I almost gave them what they wanted, almost signed away the very roof over my head, because habit is a dangerous thing, and obedience can live in the bones even after the heart resists. But then I glanced down at the page, and something snagged in me. The title of the document was not what they had promised. It did not confirm me. It erased me. My name was being replaced, crossed out as if I were a tenant overstaying my welcome, not the woman who paid the down payment with a decade of sacrifice and a jar of coins once meant for vacations I never took. I let the pen hover as though my hand trembled with age, and I said lightly that I had forgotten my glasses, that my eyes were tired, that perhaps we should do this another day. The lawyer's face did not fall, but it tightened, as if disappointment had been pressed under his skin and could not quite be hidden. My son gave me that smile, too patient, too bright, the one he used when he wanted me to obey without questions, and said, "Mom, you can trust me." Trust, as if trust had not already been traded like currency in this family until the bills were too worn to recognize. I tucked the papers into my handbag, pretending absent-mindedness, and said I would look them over at home, though I knew I would never put my name on them. The silence that followed me out of that office was not the silence of relief, but of rupture. I felt it in the parking lot when the air hit my face sharp and cold. I felt it on the drive back as they sat stiff beside me, speaking of dinner plans, school fees, vacation packages, all the ordinary language that covers rot like frosting on a spoiled cake. That evening, the house felt different, not mine, though every corner carried my history. My daughter-in-law rearranged the pill organizer I had managed for myself without fail for 20 years, clicking open compartments as though I were suddenly incapable of distinguishing morning from evening. My son spoke of retirement homes with brochures folded neatly on the counter, their glossy pictures of smiling strangers placed exactly where my hands would fall when I reached for tea. I noticed then that my name had already been peeled off the mailbox, the brass letters gone, leaving only faint outlines like a scar. And when I searched for the spare key I had kept in the ceramic dish by the door, it was missing. Probably misplaced, they said. But the words rang hollow, like footsteps in an empty church. The betrayal was not loud. It was not an explosion. It was the careful redirection of a life until you find yourself standing in your own kitchen as a guest, as a tolerated burden. But I was not yet broken. That night, while they slept in their side of the house, I opened the folder I had taken, and there, beneath the official stamps and seals, I found the truth. They had already tried to sign my name for me, the loops and slants wrong but close enough to fool a stranger. They had practiced my erasure before daring to present it to my face. I sat at the table, the papers spread before me like a crime scene, and I did not cry. I only breathed, long and steady, like a woman preparing to dive, because I knew then that what had been offered as kindness was nothing less than exile, and that the ground beneath me was still mine if only I had the strength to claim it. And in that moment, I decided I would not be a signature that vanished into someone else's ambition. I would be the refusal that held. It began with the thermostat, a small square of plastic that had never asked anything of me except a finger and a preference, now wearing a coded lock like a chastity belt for heat. The screen grayed over with a message about authorized users and an app I did not have. So I learned the new weather of my own living room by the whims of a phone I did not touch. And when I mentioned that my knees barked louder in the mornings because the air was thin and metallic with cold, my daughter-in-law sighed, as if I were critiquing her character rather than the temperature, and told me that modern systems preferred consistency, a word that meant my comfort had been replaced by a schedule she had decided upon, and because the thermostat was no longer mine. The kettle became my rebellion, that rattling metal bird on the stove, whistling long enough to fog the windows until the room remembered we were alive. The mail began to come lighter, not because the world had stopped writing, but because my name had lost weight. The brass letters peeled from the box and the carrier trained, with a note I never saw, to deliver certain envelopes to my son's household. Manager, a phrase that tasted like lemons sucked through a straw. And when I noticed that the bank statements no longer arrived in their familiar blue sleeves, I asked once and was told that paper was outdated and a security risk, and that digital copies were better for everyone, by which they meant better for the people who preferred my finances to be a rumor rather than a record. And I told them that my eyes read paper like a hand reads a shoulder, that there is comfort in the texture of truth. But my son only patted the back of my knuckles and said he would print whatever I needed, then forgot each time with the serene confidence of someone who has already moved on to his next improvement. A woman named Tasha appeared on a Tuesday with a clipboard and a citrus smell, friendly and efficient in the way of people who are paid to normalize invasions, and she told me she was there to help with activities of daily living, which I thought meant conversation and perhaps a ride to the pharmacy, until she began labeling my pantry with dates and admonitions, until she set my pills into a new plastic organizer that did not reflect my doctor's instructions, but a template on her phone, until she asked me to demonstrate how I stepped into the shower and whether I could button my own blouse, and I stood there, a grown woman with a life's worth of buttons behind me, performing competency like a trick dog at the fair, while my daughter-in-law watched from the doorway with a smile that never reached the part of her face that feels. And I realized this was not help. It was documentation, a file being built around me like a fence. The phone rang with new tones, the cheerful chirps of apps I had not chosen, reminders to hydrate and to stretch and to consider an informational session about transition housing. And when I reached for the old ring of calls from friends and the church treasurer and the library's automated voice, it was quieter than it used to be. Not because I had been forgotten, but because my number had been quietly changed to a family plan. My son assured me was a bargain, a plan whose voicemail he managed on my behalf, which meant that invitations to potlucks and small kindnesses were rerouted into a fog where good intentions go to die. They began to suggest that the guest room, with its newly installed grab bars and nightlight and rug taped to the floor, would be cozier, a word that can do terrible work when placed over the bones of control. And they brought in a new mattress. That was kinder to the hips, they said, and a smaller dresser that would keep me from overexertion. And I thanked them the way a person thanks a florist who has sent lilies to a house where lilies mean grief, because the recognition came slowly and then all at once that they were staging my life as a prelude to absence, trimming the narrative until I looked like a figure who could be tucked into a retirement brochure without anyone noticing the cut edges. When I pushed back, it was never with a shout, because I learned long ago that the most dangerous sound in a room full of people who think they own you is a woman speaking plainly. So I asked for specifics and requested copies and insisted on reading. The fine print under a lamp bright enough to hum, and I began to date a notebook in a tiny, stubborn hand, writing down the thermostat code attempts, the missing mail, the names and times of every check-in, the way my daughter-in-law corrected the family friend who greeted me as Mom and introduced me again as Mary, to see which version took root. Because those are the adjustments that matter when someone is moving you from person to property. And each line I wrote steadied me like a railing in a dark stairwell, and the very act of recording restored the proportion of my days. They spoke around me with the comfort of people who have rehearsed their parts, and I heard my son on the phone practicing the phrase, protecting her, best interests. And I heard my daughter-in-law laughing with a neighbor about the smallness of my car, a car that had carried 3 children to school through winters he has forgotten. And I watched the kitchen fill with a dietitian's suggestions while the old cast-iron skillet, seasoned by decades of hunger and celebration, was exiled to a high shelf as if the smell of onions could be a liability. And I realized that the first thing you lose when people begin to manage you is not a document or a set of keys. It is the taste of your own supper. On a Thursday, I visited the county recorder's office under the pretense of a walk, wearing my good shoes and the brooch I pinned when I needed courage to sit upright. And the woman behind the plexiglass took my request with a nod that said she had seen many versions of my face. And when she slid across the counter, a certified copy of the deed with my name printed in the ink of public fact, I felt something inside me click into place. Not triumph exactly. More like a door finally latching after a season of warping rains. And I tucked the copy into the envelope I carried in my handbag alongside old recipes and my husband's letter from a summer when love was a highway longer than we could imagine. I opened a P.O. box because the world still runs on modest rituals of independence, and the key, small and pewter and entirely mine, felt absurdly powerful against my palm. so I attached it to a ribbon and wore it under my blouse as if it were a saint's medal. And the first time the box gave me a handful of catalogs and a letter from the utilities company addressed properly, I nearly wept in the fluorescent light, because it meant that the line between me and erasure had one more knot tied. My son started leaving brochures in the fruit bowl, as if an apple would make the paper taste better. Pamphlets about assisted living that showed women my age laughing in communal rooms decorated in the color of toothpaste, and he began to use future perfect sentences, telling me that I would have more time, that I would be relieved of chores, that I would be safer among professionals, phrases that live in grammar like a prophecy. And I answered him with the present tense, that I cook, that I clean, that I am safe where I am, that my feet remember these floors. And we both understood that we were no longer speaking only about furniture and schedules, but about sovereignty. When Tasha suggested a cognitive screening, I smiled and told her she could test me if I could test her kindness, and she did not laugh. But she set her tablet down slower after that, and I learned to disarm her questions by answering with stories that had dates and proper nouns, because nothing ruins a tidy narrative of decline like a woman who remembers the exact price of a gallon of milk in the year her second child chipped his tooth on the back steps, and the color of the shirt he wore, and the neighbor's first name who drove them to the dentist, and the license plate number of the car that finally stalled for good in front of the post office on the very day the deed to this house was first stamped with the county seal. At night, I lay in the bed they preferred and stared at a ceiling they had painted a fashionable cool white, and I counted backwards from 100 by sevens to crowd out the scripts I knew they were writing for me. And in the morning, I placed my notebook by the kettle and wrote down the weather and what I cooked and who called and how the dog from 2 houses down had begun to pause at our gate as if he could hear a faint alarm. Only animals and old women detect a frequency of approaching storm. And in those lines I saw the shape of my life refusing to blur. I began to copy documents at the library, a place that has always smelled like dust and permission. And the young clerk watched me feed pages into the machine with the concentration of a surgeon and asked if I needed help. And I told her that help is a wide word that has to be earned. And she nodded as if she understood more than her haircut would suggest, and she slid me an extra paper clip. And I loved her for it, as one sometimes loves a stranger who witnesses you without ceremony. The first escalation was not a fight. It was an atmosphere that tightened day by day, a pressure system built of gentle suggestions and logged observations, and the studied patience of people who believe time will melt a woman's will. The way it melts, ice left on a porch. And if you had walked into our kitchen, you might have thought the family was thriving, the countertops gleaming, the charts updated, the elderly parent well tended. But if you had stood in my body, you would have felt the ache, where dignity strains against the harness, and you would have heard, beneath the banter about vitamin D and group activities, the low hum of a machine warming up to take something that was never theirs to touch. It changed on a night that did not look special, a Tuesday with rain that never committed to being a storm, and a house that hummed with the smug contentment of good appliances. And if you had looked through the kitchen window, you would have seen nothing but an old woman rinsing a cup while a blue light blinked on the thermostat and a stack of brochures about care options slouched in the fruit bowl. Yet under that ordinary skin, the organ of my life made a new sound, not louder, just different. like a key finally turning in a lock that had rusted from years of polite weather. I had already begun the small, quiet rebellions, dates in a notebook, a P.O., box key warm against my chest, copies of the deed folded into a plastic sleeve and hidden in the bread box among the ties and crumbs where no one ever thinks to search for a future. But the shift arrived when I opened my son's office door, not out of anger, but out of housekeeping. Or at least that was the word I offered myself as I wiped a harmless circle in the dust on his bookshelf, and my rag caught the corner of a folder labeled Transfer Packet, Property Reassignment. And I knew before I touched it that it was not a draft of a kindness. And when I set it on the desk and slid the fastener through my fingers, the pages fell open to an ugly confidence, to my name in someone else's careful hand, to lines where my signature had been. Practiced like a child practicing cursive, and tucked between the legalese was a script my daughter-in-law had written out for me. Bullet points of how to answer if I grew confused, phrases that deducted me from myself until I totaled 0, and I felt neither heat nor shock. Only the cool clarity of a woman who has finally located the source of the leak and can stop mopping. I did not take the folder because I wanted to see how people behave when they think the future is already decided. I took the copier under my arm instead. Not literally, of course, but I took the pages to the library where the machine counts your sins in dimes, and I fed each sheet to its bright mouth, while a teenager with chipped blue nail polish asked if I needed help, and I told her I did not need help. I needed witnesses, and she nodded as if she had been waiting all day to be exactly that. And when the machine spat out the last copy, I slid the warm paper into a brown envelope and wrote my name on it in red ink, the way a teacher once wrote A on the first essay I ever believed was mine. Back home, I replaced the folder exactly as I found it, corners aligned like a prayer that will be answered later. And I did the dishes as if dishes were the point of the night. And when my son came in to rummage for a snack, I asked him if he had ever noticed the squirrels on the back fence who looked like they were holding committee meetings. And he laughed and kissed the air near my hair and told me he would be working late tomorrow with our lawyer. And the word our felt like a clumsy theft. So I tucked it into my pocket with the other small words I would return to sender. In bed, beneath the fashionable cool white ceiling that made my skin look like paper, I practiced saying my name out loud, first and last, and the hyphen that the county once tried to drop from the deed, and I timed my breath to the syllables until sleep came like a visitor with good manners. In the morning, I called Irene, who once typed for a judge with a temper and a heart, a woman who has been around long enough to recognize the sound of mischief dressed in etiquette. And when she answered, she did not ask about my health or my grandchildren or the weather. She said only, "Say it." And I said it. The forgery and the folder and the thin smiles and the brochures and the thermostat and my name gone from the mailbox. And she said, "You are not a storm. You are a record." And then she gave me the number of a man who, she warned, did not smile much but listened. And that, she said, is how women like us win. I wore my husband's small brass tie tack on my collar like a charm, and took the bus to the lawyer whose office did not pretend to be a spa, just 2 chairs, a desk, and a plant that was losing. And he asked no small talk, only for the papers and the dates and the names in the order they had walked across my life. And I told him, and he wrote without interrupting, his pen moving like a measured rain over the field of a yellow pad. And when I finished, he did not say, "I'm sorry," or "This must be hard," he said. "We will need proof, copies, chronology, witnesses if you have them, a notary statement that the sample signatures are yours." And when I slid the envelope across the desk, he did not congratulate me for being clever. He nodded as if I had done exactly what any citizen should, which made me want to cry more than pity ever could. And then he asked me to write my name 5 times slow in his presence, and again, fast and again, with my left hand, to show the tremor that visits only when the coffee is mean. And he had the receptionist stamp the page with a brass seal that bit into the paper like teeth. And I left with a list longer than my patience, but lighter than my dread. Action makes a different kind of hunger, so I fed myself with ordinary bravery. I bought a small lockbox at the hardware store where they cut keys and speculate about baseball, and I chose the plain gray one rather than the pretty tin with flowers, because this was not nostalgia. It was war conducted through receipts and photocopies. And I lined the box with a dish towel that still smelled faintly of lemon oil. And I organized the contents of my life like a woman laying out instruments on a sterile tray, deed copies and tax statements and the printout from the recorder's office and the photos. Oh God, the photos of the mailbox before and after, of the thermostat's new lock screen, of the brochures artfully abandoned in the fruit bowl, and I labeled each with the date and the time until it felt less like my home was disappearing and more like I was installing an alarm. I began using cash for the things that were mine alone, not because I mistrusted my bank, but because I mistrusted how quickly a son who loved convenience could become a man who loved permission more. And I opened a new account at a credit union, where the teller called me Miss, and did not attempt to shorten me to someone she could manage. And I moved the small automatic payments that wrote my name into the calendar of the world, the phone, the lights, the small charity to which I had sent $5 a month since the year my husband forgot the word for hammer and learned it again by tapping the table and smiling at the cleverness of objects. Shifts often look like chores from the outside. I learned the breaker that made the thermostat go dark, not to spite my knees, but to remind the device who paid for the electricity that woke it. And I placed my own soft sweater over the vent in the guest room to nudge a little heat my way when the locked schedule ran lean, and I repositioned the spare key that had been misplaced to a place only women who cook would think to look, taped under the lid of the flour bin. Because if they were going to erase me with domesticity, I would write myself back with it. I taught myself to say no at a volume that did not invite a reply. And when Tasha arrived to observe my activities of daily living, I offered to make her lunch and then cooked onions in the cast iron skillet they had tried to retire. And as the kitchen filled with the smell of every winter I survived on soup and resourcefulness, I told her about the price of butter in the year the youngest had measles, and the neighbor who brought me broth in mason jars because she had been a nurse in the war, and while I spoke, I passed her a plate that would require a fork and a lap. And she put her tablet down because sometimes the only way to defeat a survey is to hand it something hot and human to hold. There were days when the resolve tasted like metal, when I woke to the soreness behind my eyes that comes from sleeping with your jaw clenched against the weight of being polite to people who do not deserve your softness. And on those days, I practiced small rituals of ownership that no court can grant or deny. I polished the banister until it remembered my hand. I planted a pot of heather on the porch because stubborn plants deserve to keep company. I stitched a loose hem on the curtain in the front room and pulled it straight so the morning could enter like a guest rather than a spy. And I spoke to my husband in the pantry, where his handwriting still lives on recipe cards that end with salt until it remembers. And I told him I was not going to disappear. Not into a home, not into a file, not into the white noise of respectable neglect. The first time my son mentioned again the community he thought would support me, I put my notebook on the table and opened it to the index I had made, dates in one column and acts in the other, and I read aloud as if I were in church, and the you scripture were mine to proclaim. The mailbox, the pills, the brochures, the folder, the forged loops of my name, and I watched the color leave his face like a dawn that had changed its mind, and he said that I was being dramatic, and I said that drama is what you call truth when you preferred the lie. I bought a red pen, not because I like theatrics, but because color helps the eye locate the heart of a document. And I began to draw small, precise circles around every place where my consent was presumed, every line where my absence was considered a courtesy, every checkbox where my signature was meant to be a rubber stamp, and I did not sign. And when asked why not, I said, because I am reading, and then later, because I am thinking, and then later still, because I am deciding. And it was astonishing how many battles I won with those three verbs. I met the lawyer again, and this time I brought a thermos of tea and my brooch pinned not for memory but for armor. And he explained injunctions and affidavits and the way a court will listen if you arrive not with outrage but with dated facts, arranged in a line long enough to walk upon without losing your balance. And he warned me that people who build their comfort on your compliance will escalate when you remove the easy path. And I told him, I have lived long enough to know that the loudest sound in a house is not a slammed door, but a lock clicking from the inside. By the end of that week, nothing had changed in a way a camera would notice, and yet everything had shifted, because I had stopped asking whether I was being fair and started asking whether I was being erased. And once you put the right question in your pocket, you reach for it instead of your apology, and your back straightens. Not from pride, but from geometry. The line of your spine, remembering it, was designed to hold. I set a pot of beans to simmer and placed the lockbox on the table next to my tea and my notebook and the deed copy, and a small apple with a bruise where it had struck the edge of the bowl, and I thought about how the bruise travels under the skin, long before the fruit looks damaged, and I decided that bruises are also proofs, and I pressed my thumb lightly against the tender place and said to the room, to the ceiling, to the house that has learned my weight and my ways, I am here. And for the first time in a long while, the house answered in its native language, a soft settling of wood, the shy sigh of an air vent opening, a far-off pipe consenting to heat. And I knew that the midpoint of my story was not a single act of defiance, but the quiet invention of a woman who would not be made simple, a woman who would take the list, the copies, the red pen, the brass seal, the lockbox, the bus route to the courthouse, the breaker number for the thermostat, the brooch and the heather and the dish towel with the lemon scent, and make of them a bridge from the years of being managed to the hour when I would manage the end myself. It is one thing to sense a current pulling beneath your feet, the subtle drag of water trying to persuade you downstream, and another thing to hear the roar of the river made plain. And in those weeks after I had begun to gather my papers and my courage The surface civility of my household cracked with a sound that could no longer be mistaken for kindness. My son, who once used to argue with me about bedtime and curfews in a voice that still trembled with the uncertainty of youth, now spoke to me as though I were a clerk in some government office standing in the way of his permit. And the change was not in the volume, but in the temperature, a sharp edge that turned every conversation into a cross-examination. I came into the kitchen one afternoon to find a stack of forms on the table, medical reports I had never authorized, notes from a doctor I had not seen in years, language about recommendation for guardianship, written in a tone that assumed rather than inquired. And at the bottom of the packet, a line for my signature, already filled in with an imitation of my hand, so clumsy it felt like an insult, as though they no longer even bothered to disguise the theft, because they assumed my silence would be their permission. I held the papers in both hands and read them slowly, my lips moving the way they used to when I was helping my children with homework, sounding out each word until its meaning became undeniable. And when I looked up, my son was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, watching me as if waiting for me to capitulate. And he said, "It's for your protection, Mom. You don't need to worry about these things anymore. We'll handle everything." I asked him what protection meant to him, whether it was the kind that shields or the kind that cages, and he frowned as if I were being deliberately difficult. And he began to raise his voice in a way I had never heard directed at me, not since he was 12, and furious that I would not let him go camping without an adult. And even then, the anger had the innocence of a boy whose world was still small enough to be safe. This was different. This was the voice of a man who had measured the value of my compliance against the inconvenience of my existence. The house itself seemed to take sides, the air stiffening when my daughter-in-law entered a room, her perfume cutting sharp corners, her smile stretched too thin, and she wielded guilt with the precision of a surgeon. She sat me down one evening after the children had gone to bed, spreading school bills and mortgage statements before me as though laying out evidence of a crime, and she said, "Do you want your grandchildren to lose their stability, their school, their friends? Do you want to be the reason they have to move?" Her eyes glittered not with tears but with calculation, and I recognized the performance, the way she pressed her hand against mine as if to transmit sincerity, the way she paused to let the silence do the work of accusation. I wanted to tell her that children do not lose stability because a grandmother keeps her house. They lose it when adults teach them that love is a transaction, when they learn too early that affection comes with ledgers and contracts. But I did not speak those words aloud. Instead, I withdrew my hand and told her I had paid mortgages long before she knew the word, and that this roof had sheltered storms she had never stood in. And her smile collapsed into something harder, a line drawn across her mouth that promised she would not forgive my refusal. The escalation was not only in voices and papers, but in atmosphere, the slow replacement of ordinary comforts with strategies of erasure. My car, which I had driven with care for 2 decades, vanished from the driveway one morning, and when I asked where it was, my son said it had been towed for repairs, though no mechanic had called, and no receipt appeared. And for 2 weeks, I was dependent on rides that always came with lectures about safety and responsibility, until finally I walked 3 blocks to the nearest bus stop with my purse clutched like a lifeline and discovered that the car had in fact been sold. The title transferred without my knowledge, And when I confronted him, he shrugged and said it was old, unsafe, more trouble than it was worth. I felt then the kind of silence that is heavier than any scream, the silence of realizing that the people you raised believe they can edit your life like a draft, striking out what no longer suits their story. At church, where the hymns once lifted me like wings, I began to notice whispers that stopped when I approached, the careful glances at my son and his wife, the polite questions about whether I was managing all right. And I realized they had begun to write my reputation in the mouths of others, planting stories of confusion and frailty, so that by the time I would resist formally, it would look like denial rather than defense. My own history was being rewritten in real time, and I understood with a clarity that burned. If I did not act, I would be erased, not only from the deed, but from the memory of who I had been. The confrontation reached its peak on a Sunday evening. The house smelling of roast chicken, I had seasoned myself as proof that I still commanded both appetite and skill. And my son sat across from me, the children sent upstairs, the table bare, except for the folder of documents that had become the weapon of choice in this quiet war. He pushed it toward me with the weariness of a man who believes patience is a favor. And he said, "Mom, this can't go on. You're being unreasonable. Everyone agrees this is the best solution." Everyone, in his mouth, meant him and his wife and the lawyer who smiled too smoothly. Perhaps a banker or two, but certainly not me. The only name on the deed, the only one who had earned the right to call this house her own. I told him that everyone did not live in my body, that everyone did not carry the memory of selling heirlooms to pay for braces, that everyone did not hear his father's voice in the walls when the wind blew hard, and that until everyone had lived my life, their consensus meant nothing. He slammed his hand on the table then, a gesture so violent it startled even him, and he muttered something about not having time for this, about things being easier if I would just cooperate. And I saw in that moment not the boy I had raised, but a man who had convinced himself that his mother's existence was negotiable. My daughter-in-law arrived late to that confrontation, her hair perfect, her eyes bright, with the certainty of someone who believes victory is inevitable. And she sat down as if taking her seat in a boardroom, folding her hands neatly and leaning forward to say, "This resistance is only hurting you. We love you, but you're not thinking clearly. Let us do this for you." And the word love in her mouth was like vinegar, sharp and sour. Because love does not say for you when it means against you. I looked at both of them then and felt a surge, not of fear, but of anger so clean it almost tasted sweet, because anger, when it comes late in life, is not the hot chaos of youth, but the distilled clarity of survival. I told them that I was thinking more clearly than I had in years, that I had every document, every copy, every note dated and signed, that I had spoken to a lawyer who did not smile but did listen, and that if they pressed me further, the only thing they would inherit from me was the memory of a woman who refused to be stolen. Their faces shifted then, my son's flush fading into something like shame, though he would not admit it. My daughter-in-law's eyes narrowing with the recognition that the battle would not be as simple as they had hoped. And the air in the room thickened until even the walls seemed to lean closer, and I felt the weight of years of invisibility roll off me like a shawl I no longer wished to wear. The escalation had brought us here, to the edge of rupture. And though the night ended with slammed doors and a silence so sharp it hummed, I knew the tide had turned, because once a woman names the betrayal aloud, it cannot return to being. Suggestion. It becomes fact, and facts once spoken are impossible to erase. It happened on a morning that looked like any other. A pale winter light pressed thin against the kitchen windows, and the kettle making that small, fretful sound before it decides to sing. But I had woken with a steadiness I had not felt since the day I first signed my name on the deed, and I moved through the quiet rooms, laying out what I needed the way a woman sets a table for guests she intends to feed rather than impress. The lockbox with its gray mouth of facts, the red pen that had become my spine on paper, the folder Irene had insisted I carry in a canvas tote, so plain it rendered me invisible in the way that keeps a person truly safe. And on top of everything, I placed a single sheet with my signature written 5 times under a notary. Seal that bit the page like teeth, because the law, for all its slowness, recognizes a bite when it sees one. I wore my husband's tie tack again at the collar, like a small brass lighthouse, drank my tea, and called the lawyer before doubt could gather its old fog around my knees. And when he answered, I heard in his voice the same weather I felt in my chest. Not thunder, not sunshine, but that honest middle climate in which action is the only way forward. We met at the courthouse, where the floors remember more grief than any one person should be asked to bear. And we filed, line by line, an emergency petition to enjoin any transfer. And the clerk stamped my name with the indifferent mercy of bureaucracy, a mercy I accepted with gratitude because indifference, properly harnessed, can be a shield. And I walked out with a paper that turned the air around me to solid ground. The sheriff's office surprised me with its plain kindness. A woman with strong hands and uncomplicated eyes reading the order twice, and then looking up to ask whether I had a place to stay if the day turned rough. And I told her I did not intend to leave my house, and that it was the others who had mistaken my presence for an error that needed correcting. And she nodded as if to say that a line had been drawn, and her boots were on the right side of it. We set a time because these things, no matter how personal, move on schedules. And while the clock marched toward noon, I called the locksmith whose card I had kept tucked like a talisman behind a recipe for cornbread. And the young man who arrived wore his competence like a clean shirt, no swagger, only focus. And he stood on the porch, listening, while I explained that the locks on a home are not just metal and pins, but the grammar of belonging, and that today we would be rewriting the sentence. In my favor, Irene texted me a thumbs up, and then the full stop of a period, because she knows the difference between cheerleading and witness. And I set a plate of store-bought cookies on the kitchen counter, because hospitality is my last superstition. And I needed something to do with my hands while the locksmith's drill spoke the language of endings. When the sheriff's deputy and the process server arrived, the house, which had been holding its breath for months, seemed to exhale, the staircase giving a small, settling sigh, the vents opening with a polite cough. And I thought of how wood records pressure and then releases it when the storm passes, and I wanted to believe that this was such a day. We posted the order on the inside of the front door because I was done apologizing in the open air, and we walked room to room like curators in a museum reacquainting themselves with provenance. And I pointed to the thermostat, whose new lock code had been a leash, and to the mailbox, where the outline of my name still ghosted the brass, and the deputy wrote details in a neat hand that made me feel, for the first time in too long, that reality had a ledger and I was back on it. My son pulled into the driveway as the locksmith was sorting new keys into small paper envelopes stamped with a blue logo, and he came in fast, face flushed, words already leaping ahead of sense. "Mom, what is this? What are you doing? You can't do." This, we had a plan, and I watched his eyes take in the deputy's uniform, the posted order, the locksmith's patient posture, and I observed the moment when certainty fell out of his pockets and clattered to the floor. I did not raise my voice because power is not volume. I handed him a copy of the injunction and told him that until a judge said otherwise, the house was not a negotiation, the house was mine, and that any attempt to alter that truth would be met not with conversation but consequence. He began to speak of family and misunderstanding and lawyers who exaggerate. He reached for tenderness as if it were a key he could produce and open me. But the key did not fit because he had neglected to oil it with respect for too long, and I watched him understand that pleading is not the same as undoing. My daughter-in-law arrived a few minutes later in a coat that looked expensive enough to hurt if you spilled soup on it, and she stepped inside with that brittle poise she wears like perfume, and the deputy greeted her by name from the papers, which made her falter, just enough that I saw the girl she used to be before strategy taught her to smooth every surface. She asked to speak privately, in a tone that assumed privacy as a right, and I told her that privacy had been the problem all along, that things done in corners had fed this day, and we would not go back into any of those small rooms. We would stand in the doorway because sunlight is an antiseptic even in winter. She tried the children. She tried my supposed fragility. She tried the word legacy, pressing it until it became a bruise. And when it did not yield, she tried anger, accusing me of humiliating them, of involving strangers, of choosing pride over love. And I said that pride is what love looks like when it is exhausted from being mistaken for servitude. The deputy, to her credit, kept her gaze on her clipboard and let my words sit in the air where they belonged. And when my son reached for the folder on the counter, the one I had intentionally placed within his reach to see whether habit would win, the deputy placed her hand gently on the paper and said, "Sir, don't." And I saw the smallest rivulet of relief move through me because authority had finally decided to stand beside me rather than across from me. The eviction, that word I had dreaded because it carries images of mothers dragging mattresses and children crying into cardboard, did not look like any of those tragedies in my house. It looked like boxes, labeled with neat stick-on tags I had. Prepared at dawn, Adam's office, Lisa's closet, kids' bathroom, stacked by the door like arguments laid out in order. It looked like me wrapping the fake signature page in a sheet protector and placing it on top of the highest box with a single word written in my red pen that had been both sword and balm these months, a word I had practiced silently in the pantry and now wrote for the record. No. It looked like the locksmith handing me the new keys one by one, as if he were returning to me. Knuckles I had once surrendered, brass ovals warm from his palm to mine, and it looked like the deputy asking, very softly, "Are you sure?" Not about the legality, which was firm, but about the ache, which could not be helped. And me answering that, sometimes a mother does not get to choose whether her children hurt. She gets to choose only whether the hurt is honest. My son gathered his things with a stiffness that told me he had not yet learned the difference between dignity and denial. My daughter-in-law whispered into her phone with the rabid calm of a person who believes a call can change gravity. And I stood by the window where the begonias would go in spring and counted my breaths, not to keep from crying, but to count myself alive. And when they stepped onto the porch with the last of their boxes, I followed, not to gloat, but to ensure that my feet knew the path out as well as the path back in, because ownership is also a geography. I changed the alarm code while the locksmith finished the back door, choosing numbers that meant something only to me. The year my mother taught me to braid my hair without a mirror. The day my husband proposed in the parking lot with the ring still warm from his hand. The hour my first paycheck as a widow cleared and I realized I could keep the lights on. And the beeps sounded like punctuation, firm and final. When the cars pulled away, the quiet that fell was not the emptiness of abandonment, but the quiet of a stage after the curtain comes down and the crew sets about restoring the space to itself. And I walked through each room, returning objects to their ordinary places, not as a maid tidying, but as a woman re-inhabiting. And I opened windows to air out the last stale scripts, and I made a pot of beans because victory is nothing without supper. I wrote a short note and slid it through the mail slot of the neighbor who had looked at me with that kind of deliberate blindness people adopt to avoid involvement. A note that said only, "If you need me, I am here." Because that is the kind of woman I choose to remain even after battle. I took the posted order down from the inside of the door and filed it in the lockbox. And then, because symbolism matters to the heart even when the head has won, I took the fake signature page back out of its sleeve and taped it to the inside of the bread box where I keep recipes and courage. And under the red "No," I added, in my neatest hand, my full name, the name that once hung in brass on the mailbox and will again. And I traced each letter slowly as if teaching a child to read, because I was, in a way, teaching myself to recognize in print what I had always known in bone. As dusk came, the house altered its posture from guarded to generous, the floorboards loosening their careful hold on groans, the radiators agreeing to purr rather than hiss. And I took my tea to the porch and watched the last box-shaped shadows lengthen on the step where I had first taught my son to tie his shoes. And I let the sorrow pass through me without argument, because sorrow, like weather, does its work and moves on. And when the kettle inside clicked itself off, I went back to a kitchen that finally smelled like mine. Onions, soap, the faint metal scent of new keys in a bowl. And I understood that the climax of my life was not the arrival of the deputy or the change of a lock, but the decision, made and remade, to turn toward myself without flinching, to select my own name over the soft coercions of convenience, to walk the perimeter of my chosen country, and know it holds. By the time the keys stopped feeling foreign in my palm and the house learned the rhythm of my footsteps again, the noise in my head had quieted to something like weather, far off over the water, a rumble that acknowledged what had passed without insisting on returning, and I woke on a mild morning with light folding itself across the hallway in long, respectful bands, and thought, this is how peace arrives, not with trumpets, but like a careful nurse who knows where to put her hand. I boiled eggs and buttered toast and ate standing by the sink the way I used to when the children were small, and breakfast was an intermission rather than a meal, only this time there was no hurry at my back, only the small domestic music of pipes, and birds and the kettle's soft complaint, and after I washed my plate, I opened the tin of seed packets I'd hoarded through the bad months and chose begonias and a scrappy handful of zinnia because I wanted something that would argue with the soil in bright colors and win. I pulled on gloves, the good leather ones from years ago that know my fingers, and went to the porch where the air smelled faintly of rain and cut wood, and I set the flats in the dirt, turning clumps with the old trowel that has lost its shine but not its purpose. And I said my husband's name into the morning in the same voice I used to reserve for errands, light and ordinary, as if he were in the next room and would answer when I was done. And I told him that I had remembered the breaker, number, and the case number, and my own number, which is to say, my worth, and that the house had come back to me the way strong things do, slowly, stubbornly, with a memory for who paid attention. The mail came while I was on my knees, the carrier's footsteps steady on the walk, and when I opened the box, there it was, my name newly screwed back onto the brass in tidy letters, a weight I could feel even when I wasn't looking, and tucked behind a circular and a charity appeal sat a postcard of a bookstore with a bell over the door, the handwriting spare and decent. I'm reading more. I'm eating enough. I'm learning to make coffee without burning it. I love you. K. I carried it inside and pinned it to the corkboard by the phone, which is just a habit now because the numbers I need live in my hands. Later, I wrote a letter on thick paper that takes ink like it's a compliment, not to the past, but to another woman I have never met and somehow know well, the one who has learned to apologize for needing light and heat in her own kitchen, who laughs at the right moments, so no one notices the way her mouth keeps the taste of promises too long. And I told her that the world will try to convince her that obedience is love because it makes everything smoother for everyone else. But the truth is that love has room for disagreement and for a door that closes when it must, and that one day she will set a plate on the counter and realize she has made a meal for the person she is becoming, and it will be enough. I did not give advice about courts or locks because those are local matters, and women are national. What I gave her were instructions for the small rituals that restored me when the larger machinery frightened me. The notebook by the kettle where I dated my life back into being. The P.O. box key on its ribbon like a private anthem. The coat with honest pockets. The habit of buying flowers that do not apologize for blooming where they are planted. In the afternoon, Arthur knocked, a courtesy knock that asked rather than assumed, and we sat with tea that I let steep a minute longer than I used to, because patience no longer tastes like punishment, and we spoke about birds, and then, because we are old enough to skip the scenic route, about relief, and he told me that there is a kind of forgiveness that does not invite a person back into your house, only back into the world. And I said that I was trying that kind, and we let the porch be quiet, in agreement. When he left, I walked the rooms the way farmers walk fence lines after a storm, checking for breaches not in wood or wire, but in the places where I used to disappear. And I found none. Only the ordinary scuffs of living and the sweet frivolity of a rug I do not have to defend. Toward dusk, I took the fake signature page from the bread box and slid it behind the others so it would not be the first thing my hand touched when reaching for recipes. I will keep it as a museum keeps a warning, and when I feel the old inclination To make myself small, I will hold it to the light and remember that quiet complicity has a handwriting, and I no longer recognize it as my own. The phone rings sometimes with numbers I know by muscle memory, and sometimes I answer when it is the boy, and we speak about bus schedules and the taste of pears and the way a life can become breathable if you move trust from a single fragile shelf to the whole architecture of your day. And sometimes I let it go to the machine when it is the people who confuse shame with strategy. And in either case, I do not feel cruel. I feel edited by my better self. I have learned that endings are not debts to be collected, but calendars to be turned, and that some months must be torn off with both hands. At night, I leave one lamp on in the front room, not as a beacon for someone who will not come, but as proof to myself that light is not something I must ask permission to keep. And I sit with my feet on a stool that belonged to my mother, and I think of how women survive, with lists and recipes and a red pen, with neighbors who mind their own business until asked not to, with plants that bloom because no one told them the soil was inhospitable, with a spine that remembers how to rise even after long seasons of bending. If you find this, if your hands are shaking and your mouth is framing the polite no that will be taken as yes, come sit by me in the mind's kitchen for a moment and listen. You did not outlive whole years to be negotiated out of the last rooms that know your name. You did not carry children and groceries in grief so that someone could swap your keys for a schedule. And you do not owe anyone the performance of diminishing yourself so their comfort can stand upright. Plant something with a belligerent color. Write the date on the corner of the page. Wear the coat that reminds you of your own shoulders. And when the question comes, as it will, of whether you are sure, say yes the way a door says yes when it closes, on the right side of a lock, the way a house says yes when its windows are opened after a long winter, the way a woman says yes when she is finally speaking to the only jury that matters, the one in her chest that has ruled in her favor and will not be overruled.